The dust on Kareth 7 was the color of old bone. Mara Voss knew this because it was the last thing she saw before the emergency chutes failed, and the pod hit at 34 meters per second, and her helmet cracked against the instrument panel, hard enough to turn the world white. When the white faded, the dust was still there, sifting through the buckled hull seam in slow, lazy curtains, catching the light of a sun that was 2 shades too orange to feel like home. She ran a systems check before she allowed herself to breathe. Old habit. Check the machine first, then check yourself, because one of you can be repaired. The pod was done. Thrusters dead. Comms array gone somewhere in the upper atmosphere, probably scattered across 100 kilometers of rust-colored highland. Emergency beacon was transmitting on a frequency that would take 11 months to reach the nearest relay, and another 11 to bounce back a response. She filed that fact in the same drawer she kept other unworkable numbers and moved on. Devon? She unclipped her harness and turned. Devon, talk to me. Davon Osi was upside down in his crash seat, still strapped in, one arm hanging at an angle that said something in it was broken. His visor was fogged, but his chest was moving. Talk to me, she said again, and this time his eyes opened. I am talking, he said. I'm talking very quietly so I don't wake up whatever broke my arm. She almost laughed. That was the thing about Devon. He made you almost laugh even when the world was ending, which in their line of work happened more often than the mission briefings ever acknowledged. She got him down, set his arm as well as she could with the medkit's bone seal injector, while he bit down on a piece of pod insulation and made a sound that was not quite a scream. Then she helped him stand, and they both stood in the wreckage and looked at what was left of the mission. They had been sent by the Continuance Commission to survey candidate worlds. Kareth 7 had looked good from orbit. Nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere within range, liquid water traces, temperature bands that wouldn't kill an unprotected human inside of 10 minutes. The Commission needed 3 viable candidates. Humanity had burned through its margin on old Earth 2 generations ago, and the Ark colonies were full. They needed somewhere to go. Kareth 7 had looked good. The exterior sensor pod had survived. Mara propped her boot against the hull and pulled the readout screen around to face her. Aria, she said. Atmospheric analysis. Full spectrum. The AI's voice came through the pod's internal speakers, flat and precise, undamaged by the crash in that uncanny way of things that didn't have skulls to rattle. Nitrogen 71%, oxygen 22%, trace CO2, argon, methane within acceptable parameters. Particulate count elevated, no detected toxins above threshold, atmosphere is breathable. Recommend standard precautionary observation period of. Noted, Mara said. She kept her helmet on, so did Devon. They looked at each other through their visors, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was, this was too easy, and the Commission surveyors had a saying about worlds that looked too easy. And that saying was not optimistic. The highland plateau where they had come down was maybe 3 kilometers across, ringed by a low ridge of fractured rock that glittered like dark glass. Beyond the ridge, terrain dropped away into something vast. A depression that had probably been a sea once. Now a flat white expanse the size of a continent interrupted by nothing, no vegetation, no movement, no structures or tracks or burrows or any of the 10,000 signatures that meant biology had established a foothold somewhere and was doing what biology always did. Spreading. Clean, Mara thought. Sterile, almost. She logged it and moved on. They spent the first 6 hours doing what surveyors did, documenting, sampling, cataloging. Davon worked with his good arm, which was his dominant arm, so the catalog came out precise and professional. He had a way of describing what he saw that was almost too beautiful for technical documentation, full of small asides and observations that the Commission's reviewers always flagged as non-standard, and that Mara always fought to keep in. Because the things Davon noticed, the way the orange light made the ridge rock look like hammered copper at dusk, the way the wind had a cadence to it that sounded almost like breathing. Those things mattered. They mattered because if humanity was going to live somewhere, the people deciding needed to know not just the numbers, but the feeling of it. She had started to think it might be somewhere humans could bear to live when Davon stopped cataloging. He was standing at the ridgeline, looking down into the white depression below. He had been standing there for 3 minutes. She clocked it without meaning to, the way she clocked everything, because that was her brain, always counting. Devon. He didn't turn. She walked to him. She stood beside him and followed his gaze down into the white, and she still didn't see anything. Just the same flat expanse they'd been looking at all day. You all right? Yeah, he said. His voice was fine. Normal cadence, normal register. Just, did you see that? See what? It was probably nothing. He turned and smiled at her through the visor, and the smile was his smile, the one she'd known for 6 years of surveys and 2 years before that in the program. Nothing wrong with it. Come on, let's finish the ridge samples before the sun drops. She logged the pause and said nothing about it. She should have said something about it. By the time the sun went down, and it went down fast on Kareth 7, like something pulling a shade, the air had gone cold enough that Arya was recommending thermal gear. They ate inside the pod, seated on the angled floor because the pod's furniture had rearranged itself in the crash. Davin ate less than usual. He said his appetite was off from the arm. Mara accepted this because it was reasonable and because the alternative was unreasonable. And she was not, professionally or personally, someone who ran toward unreasonable conclusions without evidence. She had evidence by morning. She found him outside at what her suit clock said was 0400, crouched at the ridge edge, staring down. He was not wearing his helmet. He had removed it at some point in the night and set it neatly beside him on the rock. And the suit collar was open at the neck. And the air of Kareth 7 was moving across his bare face. She did not run. She walked. She walked the way you walk toward something that you needed not to startle. He looked up. His eyes were fine. His face was fine. He looked mildly puzzled, the way a person looked when woken from a dream they couldn't quite hold. It's cold, she said. Put your helmet on. He looked at the helmet beside him as if he'd forgotten it was there. Right, he said. He picked it up and put it on without argument, and that was almost more frightening than anything else. Davin without argument. Davin, who complied without a single sideways comment about overcautious protocols and the Commission's legendary distrust of survivable atmospheres. She did not sleep after that. She ran the medkit's full diagnostic suite on him at first light, cataloging what she found with the same clinical precision she brought to atmospheric samples. Elevated core temperature. Unusual platelet clustering at the neck and shoulder. Injection pattern clustering, she noted, her throat tightening, the kind of clustering you got from something entering tissue repeatedly, and in the same place. Slight subdermal discoloration along the clavicle, visible only when the medkit's UV emitter swept across it, spreading upward toward the jaw in the pattern of a root system or a river delta, seen from altitude. She kept her voice completely level. Does this hurt? He looked down at the discoloration. No, this. She touched the clavicle area through his suit. No, he said again. And then quietly, I didn't know it was there. She believed him. That was the worst part. She believed him completely. She told him what she was seeing. She told him in the same direct way she delivered all field reports. No softening, no evasion. Because Davin was not someone who needed to be managed, and she was not someone who could manage him even if he had been. She showed him the medkit screen. He looked at it for a long time. What do you think it is? He said. Something in the air, she said. Or something in the particulate. Something microscopic that Arya wasn't configured to detect. Something that's been using me as a hotel room. Something that's been establishing itself. He nodded slowly. He turned and looked out across the white depression. From up here in the day's first light, it had a strange beauty. The flatness of it. The way it caught the orange-shifted sunrise and held it like a mirror. Mara, he said. You should know something. She waited. When I look down there, I don't feel afraid of it anymore. He said it plainly, just stating fact. I'm not gone. I can still think clearly. I know who I am. But the thing that looked at that and felt wrong about it is just not firing. She understood then what she was dealing with. Not a disease. Not a parasite in the traditional sense. Something more patient and more terrible. An organism that didn't take you over. It just removed your objection to being taken over. It tuned out the frequency on which you recognized threat. It made you comfortable. She thought of every surveyor who had ever failed to send a report. She thought of the Commission's cold files. Missions that had gone quiet mid-catalog. Ships that had been recovered unmanned or not at all. She had always assumed equipment failure. Crew error. The 1,000 ordinary disasters of deep survey work. She thought about how many of those worlds had looked good from orbit. She pulled the medkit and went back into the pod and started running calculations. The math was not kind. The organism. She was already calling it that in her head. The organism, clinical distance being the only distance she had left. Spread through exposure. Davin had been outside without a helmet. She had not. But the suit seals on a field-grade commission pod were not designed for biological contamination. They were designed for atmospheric toxins and radiation, and the organism was neither. Every time she had been within 2 meters of Davin for the last day and a half. Every time she had touched his suit with her gloved hands. Every time the air inside the pod had cycled. She stopped the calculation before it finished. There was no profit in finishing it. What there was, one emergency distress canister, single use, designed to broadcast on a frequency every commission vessel was required to monitor. Range, 40 light days. Response time, unknown because no one came to Kareth 7 except surveyors, and the nearest surveyor route was considerably more than 40 light days away. What there was, the pod's landing thrusters, dead. What there was, the ridge below them, and the White Depression, and somewhere down there in that alien flatness the organism's central colony. She was guessing. But the behavior she'd observed suggested distributed intelligence, and distributed intelligences had centers. What there was, her. De found her in the storage bay pulling out the emergency field torch. Not the camp torch, the breach torch, the one rated for hull repair, the one that burned hot enough to make metal run. He stood in the doorway and looked at what she was assembling on the floor, and she could see him working it out. No, he said. Yes, Mara, you can't. He stopped, started again. Even if you go down there, even if you find the center of it, the organism is already. He touched his collarbone. I don't know how far it spread, in me. Out there, he gestured toward the expanse. You're one person with a cutting torch. I'm aware of the math. Then what are you doing? She kept her hands busy with the torch assembly because her hands needed to be doing something, or she was going to sit on the floor and not get up, and that was not allowed. That was specifically not in the plan. When we were in the program, she said, there was a simulation exercises, second year. You remember the plague scenario? He was quiet. They gave you an infected colony, and they gave you a quarantine team and they said solve it. And most people ran the numbers and quarantined the colony, and flagged it and radioed for command to make the call. And command gave you points for correct procedure. I remember, Davin said. You didn't wait for command. She looked up at him. You ran the numbers and figured out where the pathogens most concentrated, and you went there yourself and you burned it. Simulation failed you for going outside protocol. I thought it was the right call. He looked at her for a long time. Something moved behind his eyes. The real him, she thought. The part that the organism couldn't quite mute, pushing up toward the surface. I thought it was the right call too, he said quietly. The simulation grader said it was reckless. It was both, Mara said. She finished assembling the torch. She checked the fuel cell, full, enough for 4 hours of sustained burn at full output. She pulled on the thermal layer that would let her survive down in the depression for that long. She checked her helmet seals 3 times, the way her father had taught her, because the machine was what you checked first. The distress canister, she said. If I'm not back in 6 hours, fire it. If a commission vessel ever comes, tell them what we found. Tell them the world looks good from orbit. Davin caught her arm as she moved past him. Not restraining, just stopping her for a moment, the way you stopped someone before they went somewhere that required stopping. I can feel it, he said, whatever it is. I can feel it wanting me to tell you to stay, wanting me to say the right thing to make you stay. Because if you go down there, he paused. I just wanted you to know I can feel it trying. I know, she said. Go on then. He released her arm. Go be reckless. The path down the ridge was steeper than it had looked from above, the dark glass rock loose and unpredictable, and she went down on her hands and knees for the final section. The torch strapped across her back, moving toward the white expanse below with the deliberate, unspectacular stubbornness of someone who had decided and was finished deciding. No fear response. She found this interesting in a detached way. She'd been told fear was the organism's primary target. It removed the alarm that told you to leave, leaving you compliant and present and available. But she wasn't staying. She was arriving. The surface of the depression was not white after all. Up close it was the palest possible gray, fine-grained as talcum powder, and it compressed underfoot with a slight give that felt organic rather than geological. She dropped to one knee and pulled her sample probe and pushed it into the surface. The surface moved. Not dramatically, not like something erupting, more like a flinch, a full-body involuntary recoil that passed through the ground in a slow wave from the point of her probe outward, as if the entire depression were a single entity, and she had poked it. She stood up, she thought. Distributed intelligence, central colony, most concentrated source. She thought 4 hours of fuel. She thought. The commission's cold files. And all the worlds that looked good from orbit. And all the surveyors who had gotten comfortable and stopped sending reports. She thought humanity needed somewhere to go. Humanity was a species that had burned through its home and was trying to find its way to another. A species that made mistakes on a civilizational scale and then somehow kept going. A species that was worth the trouble of delivering to safety, even if no individual member of it was particularly remarkable in the scheme of things. She lit the torch. The organism, the colony, the thing, whatever it was, responded immediately and not the way she'd expected. Not with tentacles or violence or any of the horror movie architectures she'd half braced for. It responded with pressure, a kind of full sensory calm that she felt even through her sealed suit, even behind her helmet's insulation, pressing against her like warm water. It was trying to do to her what it had done to Davin, reaching through walls it hadn't expected to be there. She walked forward. She walked forward because that was what you did when something pressed against you. You put your weight into it, and you kept moving. She had not come from a species that held still. She had not come from people who were built for stillness. She came from creatures who had been cold and hungry, and afraid for 100,000 years, before they were anything else. Who had made fire because the dark was unacceptable. Who had pointed at the lights in the sky and said not yet but eventually. Who had built the ships that brought her here, to this gray expanse, on a world no human eye had ever seen, and declared it survivable. The colony did not know what to do with that. She burned. She walked and she burned, the torch eating through the surface in meter-wide swaths, and the ground convulsed around her footsteps, but it did not stop her, because it was built for something that stood still long enough to be colonized, and she was not that, she would never be that. No human was that when they decided to be otherwise. She burned for 3 hours and 40 minutes before the fuel cell gave out. She stood then in a field of char that was still glowing at the edges. The gray-white surface crystallized and dead in every direction she'd walked, and she could feel the thing's pressure differently now. Not the warm comfort it had pressed against her before, but something thinner, more diffuse, weakened. The signal of a network that had lost too many nodes to think clearly. She did not know the biology of it. She did not know if distributed intelligences could feel pain. She filed the question away for the Commission's xenobiologist and turned back toward the ridge. The climb up was harder without the torch's weight, but harder in other ways too, her legs shaking, the thermal suit fogged with her own breath, the orange sun dropping toward the glittering ridge with no interest in waiting for her. Devon was sitting on the rock at the top of the ridge when she came over the edge. He had been watching. He reached down and took her forearm without being asked and helped her up the last meter. "Well," he said. She pulled her helmet off because the seal warning was yellow and the air of Karath 7 was breathable, and she needed to breathe something that wasn't recycled for 10 seconds. "Well," she said. "It's quieter," Davin said. He touched his collarbone. "Whatever it was doing in here, it's quieter. Will it come back?" "I don't know." He looked out across the depression. From up here you could see the pattern of her burning, dark lines through the gray-white, the grid walk of a human who'd run out of methodical options and started improvising. "I don't think it's gone, I think it's..." He paused. "I think it's confused." "That'll do for now," Mara said. She sat beside him on the rock. They sat in silence for a while, the two of them on the edge of a ridge on a world that no human had named yet, watching the alien sun go down in colors that had no human names either. The distress canister was in Davin's lap. She did not reach for it. Not yet. After a long while, Davin said, "The simulation graders were right, you know. It was reckless." "Yes, it worked though." "Yes, so what does that mean?" She considered it. The wind picked up along the ridge, moving through the fractured glass rock with that sound like breathing, and she thought of all the places humanity had arrived at that were hostile and wrong and impossible, and how many of those places humanity had eventually decided to call home. "It means," she said, "that we've always been better at reckless than at still." The sun finished setting. The first stars of Karath 7 appeared, strange configurations that belonged to no human mythology, waiting patiently to be named. She picked up the distress canister and held it and did not fire at it yet, because there was still work to do. Samples to catalog, atmospheric data to finalize. A report to write that began not with the crash or the infection or the burning, but with the bare professional notation that surveyors used for all their field assessments, the one that started. Candidate world. Initial evaluation, status pending. She would write the rest of it honestly. She would write about the organism and the thing it did to the fear response, and the cold files full of quiet missions. She would write about Davan and his arm, and his willingness to tell her when something else was trying to use his voice. She would write about the burning and what it cost, and what it did and didn't solve. And she would recommend Kareth 7 for secondary survey with appropriate containment protocols, because the atmosphere was breathable and the temperature was survivable, and under that silent, patient alien threat was a world that had the bones of somewhere humans might eventually, with sufficient stubbornness, be able to live. She fired the canister. The signal went up into the dark, outward from that ridge on that world, with its alien stars and its strange wind, and its surviving gray depths, and its two humans sitting on the edge of it, waiting for someone to answer. Someone would answer. They always answered. That was the other thing about humanity. It listened for its own.